I will ask all those present, from right to left, Professor Christos Kollias and Professor Avia Spivak, who was Deputy Governor of the Bank of Israel, and Dr. Adi and Yael Mevorach, who is the deputy of the person responsible for budgets. How do we have to treat the budget? Does the defense budget, does it have to be part of the general budget? Does the defense budget have to be a % of the GDP? Or do we have to set every year, every 5 years, do we have to set the defense budget in a realistic manner? Again, as part of the budget, then if we take it as part of the budget, it's a custom to say, I'll explain in a moment why, that the defense budget is 16% of the state budget. Is this the right thing to do? Can we bring it down? Do we have to increase it? There are those who said that we have to set the budget as a percentage of the product. And when we talk with people from the defense, they always talk about a percentage of the GDP. Why? Because in recent years, the defense budget as a percentage of the GDP decreased to 5.8%, and it went up to 6.4% or 6.6%. And if you remember what we had after the Yom Kippur War, when the defense budget was a percent of the GDP, when it surpassed the 30%, the decrease was unbelievable. And I want to relate to the previous discussion. What we saw in the previous discussion was, as far as I was concerned, when they took one sock off one foot and put it on the other foot. And that means that if you want money for education, for welfare, for infrastructure, all the money is there in security and defense. And the big question is, can we cut the defense budget or not? If you can't cut the defense budget, then the whole previous discussion was superfluous. Now, with relating to what Adi said, what is this defense budget? In the Spivak and the Mossad, is that part of the defense budget as well? What about, again, the Atomic Energy Council? Is that part of the defense budget? So no, the defense budget, as was set and determined by the government and was ratified by the cabinet, on the basis of 58 billion shekels, with an addition of another 4 billion shekels for the good behavior on the part of defense sector. So it was 4 billion shekels. So we already have 60 billion shekels. And then another 8 billion. Again, this depends on new income. So we have 68 billion shekels for income. And then we have another budget in the reserves. Whoever wants to know about it knows that it's for the Spivak and the Mossad. It is now 8 billion shekels. So we had 68 before, another 8 brings us to 76 billion shekels for defense. Now, I'm going by statistics. Official statistics from the Ministry of Finance, and I've not made these up. And this is what the Ministry of Finance says in the three-annual plan that was presented to the government for public order and defense, okay? So MAGAV and security or no security. So in 2017, that is next year, out of a budget of 360 billion shekels, 90 billion goes for public order and security or defense. So not 16% that I mentioned before, but it's actually 25% goes to security and defense. Yael, correct me if I'm wrong. As far as I think, it's my humble opinion that this budget, again, various expenditure that was placed in the box are not included. What does that mean? Building a security fence on the border with Jordan. All sorts of expenses that the IDF says, it's not me. I'm not responsible. You would like to build a security fence on the Jordanian border. Take contractors and build a fence. If you want me to do it, you have to pay me extra. So all sorts of expensive, okay? The move of the IDF to the Negev. Also, it's in the box. Huge, a lot of billions of shekels. So we surpass the 25% of the budget. And when we are told that the overall expenditure of the state of Israel is low compared to international standards, we have to take into account that a big part of the expenditure of the state of Israel is for defense purposes. That means that the state expenditure on education and health and welfare and all the other civil areas is even lower. I want to go back now to the question that I mentioned at the beginning. And I'm going to ask the three guests. How can we set the defense budget? Must it be, again, just done, isolated every year or every 5 years or whatever it be? Or does it have to be as a percentage of the budget or as a percentage of the GDP? Please.
Thank you. Although I am not an expert on the Israeli defense budget, I will try to communicate with you what I would probably call some sort of international experience or other questions that we are posing within our community. One aspect is something that you have already mentioned. It's this intersection between defense and security. And as the global security environment changes, we gradually get the feeling that there is a large area where defense in the old traditional way, defense against another state, intersects with security against modern security challenges. And therefore we should have a more holistic approach to defense and security, and therefore include other budget items when we discuss about the security of a country. This implies that there may be the need for institutional changes in how we budget for our national security, and most importantly, in how we measure how efficiently we use the money we invest in security, because this is an investment, in my view. And unfortunately, I think internationally there is a deficit in terms of discussing the efficient use of resources that we use in defense and security, and whether we can buy the same level of defense and security with a different mixture of expenditures and a different mixture of policies when it comes to this area. So this would be my input to your very lively debate, I think, being I understand that I'm not an expert. Efficiency, transparency, and accountability are the three key words that I would actually use.
Okay, so if I may, I will expand on that. We held a number of encounters a few years ago. We called it Van Leer, security at Van Leer. There were experts on security and defense, military personas, economists, and then we decided we can't actually deliberate properly because we didn't have all the figures. So this maybe leads me to that transparency that I wish to mention. Military seniors and whoever was there actually complained. I won't say who was there because I don't want to gossip, but people who were there said that one of the basic problems in the Israeli defense system is that the commander, military commander, again, the chief commander, which is the government, not the chief of staff, that's according to Israeli law, that chief does not define the missions for the IDF, does not set a national strategy, and doesn't do anything. So this relates to what Adi said. In the case that chief military commander doesn't do this, then nothing, what can we do except, and then the project committee can only say it will have to be a certain percentage of the budget. And the sum that was fixed there actually wanted to try and decrease the weight of the defense budget within the general budget. So you can come and say, okay, there are certain places where governments do that, do take charge. So yes, an example, that's true. There's the white paper, for example. The paper for security and defense that was done in France in 2008, or was it 2009? And in this plan, this paper, there was actually a committee headed by one of the ministers, appointed by the president, and they decided to make complete change in everything in France. No more forces for land defense. You need units for terrorism. They changed the entire structure of the army. Now, Israel, to a certain extent, also underwent certain similar things, like the peace with Egypt, again, Syria disintegrating. You would expect that in Israel there would be a similar process, but no such thing happened. the size of the defense budget was always as a result of some sort of negotiations and bartering between the government and the Ministry of Finance. So I think that something is wrong from the very core. The second remark that I wish to make with regards to what Adi said. He said that defense security doesn't always go for according to GDP per capita, and I think an economy of scale also plays a part. I think there were, again, in certain countries, a certain army could protect a certain amount of people, and that is why maybe the budget has to be decreased. Then there is something to be said for economy of scale. Why do we need such a huge budget? So the answer was things are becoming more expensive. But what is becoming more expensive? The jets, yes, but the F-35. Okay. So what's the idea? I mean, it has something endogenic, doesn't it? I mean, in and how much that's military equipment costs. So you would expect for certain things to be cheaper because the electronics and the resolutions and the capabilities. Certain things should be cheaper, right? Something is a little weird. It keeps getting more and more expensive. I don't get it. So maybe we don't need it. So the basic question is, how do you build it from the bottom, not only from the top? I think it has to be built from the bottom as well. Now, regarding a civil body, naturally speaking, it should have been the National Council for Security. However, our country, what can we do, is such that the head of the National Council, the Security Council, understands that he'll have much more impact if he sits really close to the Prime Minister's ear, and it will be much more beneficial if he writes all sorts of papers. Maybe he'll have an excellent team writing excellent papers and articles, but at the end of the day, who convinced the Prime Minister to do so and so? It's somebody who's sitting close to him. So the most important thing is for his room to be close to the Prime Minister's room. That is the most important thing. So that they walk out, they can run across each other in the corridor. Moti keeps saying that everything is personal. I don't agree that everything is personal, but in certain things, sometimes that personal aspect is very important. And another thing that I wish to say, and I'll expand on it later, but the whole question about the figures, the statistics, and the transparency, I think that is one of the ailments. How could it be that we don't know where the money is going? The very rough divisions, this goes for salary, this goes for equipment. Why can't we know exactly where the money is going? And I'll give you an example from the pension funds, the military pension funds. I'll talk about that later. Why should we not know what? If they pay pension, okay, how many people are you paying a pension to? What is it, such a huge secret? I mean, in the CIPRI's figures, you could see the size of the army size. What, CIPRI's wrong? So they'll know how many people went out to pension from the Israeli army. So what's the big deal? And this lack of transparency, of course, serves the system. And if, in addition to this, there are probably internal wars as well. And what you said before, I imagine there are internal conflicts and wars. And as a result of these, certain statistics are not published because certain people within the military system doesn't want it to be published. So I think that I imagine we can have an army, a different type of army. You can build an army differently. You can make it compatible with the goals that we have today. You can build it from bottom up, because things are different. And you can also publish the budget of the Shabak and the Mossad. And if it has increased so much because we have cyber and also things, we have the right to know. Why not? So let me relate to a few points that came up here. Again, in the mirror of in light of the fiscal rules. But as you said, I'm sorry, we cannot hear the speaker. Can she please speak closer to the microphone? Please speak closer to the microphone. Okay, again, the rules keep changing. Another thing that's important to remember is the policy de facto. How did what was the fiscal policy like? And if you look 10 years back, or a little more, there's been a significant decrease in the size of the government. Again, which is because of the decrease in interest and the defense expenditure in relation to the product. I don't think this is anything new. Now, the question is about, again, looking forward. I would like to compare this again to the American rules versus the Israeli rules or laws. In the United States, in the federal budget, there are two different rules. There are rules for defense expenditure, which is completely detached from the civil expenditure, and they're completely detached from the social expenditure, which emanate from demography, meaning there are rights in legislation to health services or pension, and most of the budget, which is the social expenditure, again, develops with the demography. It's a very significant part of, again, that increasing debt of the USA. And there are two rules of expenditure which are not connected to each other. They are disconnected from each other for civil budget and for military budgets or defense budgets. I think it has a few disadvantages in comparison to our. I'm not trying to, again, do any trade-off between the civil expenditure and defense budget expenditure, because the civilians actually pay for both through taxes. Now, the disadvantage is that the expenditure is not under one sort of umbrella or rule, and that is why expenditure that is, which is on the increase because of demography, because of, let's say, all sorts of immigrants and such, and the deviant of that is that the budget is affected. It's not constant. Now, we have a rule, one constant rule for all expenditure. It has a number of disadvantages, yes, but I think it also has a lot of advantages in comparison to the American system, because it's looking at the whole cake and it's dividing it up as a derivative of policy. And there's also a trade-off between the defense and civil expenditure or budget. But what do the figures look like in comparison, or looking a few years ahead into the future? And I think you can see this in our publications as well. And now, if you want to, I'll expand on that later. But basically, we have a number of components, and the component is that it requires us, as the Ministry of Finance, we have to publish twice a year all the government obligations that are the known obligations. And again, we do civil, the civil area and the military and so forth. And in fact, we have to present the policy or the picture vis-a-vis the policy and what is happening de facto, and that we have to do by law. And it adds a lot of value, the fact that we have to publish all of these things. Again, the knowledge is not always conducted properly in the government, but at least we have this obligation to publish everything. And it gives some sort of an overall picture with regards to the different trends. I think, again, we worked on it very intensively in the past year and a half. We collected figures, and now we are presenting them in an orderly manner. So what do the statistics look like? What do the figures look like? So as far as the defense and security is concerned, if I look at 2015 in comparison to 2019, I'm talking about security. And I'm not talking about, again, public order now. I'm talking about services and all expenditure, all defense and security, etc., but not in internal security. Again, in light of the past summary, or again in wake of the rise in salaries and all the different decisions, it will come down from 6.1 to 5.4% of the product, of the GDP, which is a significant decrease. The few maybe conditions. So which year? That's 2019. Till 2019, that's what will happen. That was the decrease that I mentioned. There are two things that should be mentioned. First of all, that this budget, again, is on condition, okay? There are certain conditions there. You have to remember it hasn't happened yet. And the second thing is that we're at the beginning of the process as yet. And the figure that I gave you is, again, in the assumption that the agreement will hold water till 2019. And, you know, you understand that. And in addition to this, the civil budget as a percentage of the GDP increased from 17.8 to 18.4 from 2015 till 2019. So in this context, I have to say that the figures that I just mentioned, that decrease in the security budget in relation to the budget and the increase in the civil budget, again, it doesn't sort of live in peace with the fiscal rules, if I can say so. And this relates to what you said, Adi. These are, again, proposals to be accepted. It doesn't mean that the government can actually fund these decisions. But in this context, let me just say that this tool of the numerator, which actually obligates, it says something very simple. It says, let's not take decisions that we don't know how to fund. And it sort of limits the cuts and the flexibility. Maybe it will allow us to be able to achieve our goals. Again, it's difficult to do it with a biannual budget, by the way. And everything has to be planned for 2 years in ahead. It's a challenge. But we are very much committed to it. The entire system is. And I think it is a tool that will better serve this multi-annual planning and the succession or this continuum on which we are working over time.
What will the overall spending look like in the future? And the defense and civilian budgets, how will they look in light of the constraints? I don't have an answer because we're in the middle of consolidating the budget and consolidating policy. And these subjects are currently being discussed in the Treasury, so I can't relate specifically. But I can say regarding the overall expenditure, as a long-term rule, that stands at 2.7% real growth when our economy in its steady state is growing at about 3% a year. I think this is a reasonable rule. I would add to that one more statement, and that is that ultimately the fiscal policy is a connection of three things: of the spending, the revenue, and the capital. I think the spending is relatively low today. I won't get into the whole cycle, although that's important too. But if we take 5 years back or even more, there is very little willingness among the public to raise taxes. And when there's no willingness to raise taxes, the trade-off is clear. And I think that we see the economy growing by 3% and the government 2.7%. That is a desirable policy. I'll stop here. Adi. First of all, regarding your question, should the defense budget be part of the budget? I think that the answer is yes. I think that unequivocally it is part of the choices that a state makes. A government has to decide how much security it wants to give its citizens. I would assume that most governments know more or less what the first derivative is. When you increase defense spending, you generally get more defense. And I don't know if they know how to quantify it in precise terms, but in general terms, in most public services, that's the case, that when you spend more, you get more. You can always make it more efficient, less efficient, but I think that that's a part of it. And there's a price tag attached to that. When you decide to spend more on defense, you pay a price. that either people will pay more taxes, or you'll leave a greater debt to your children, or you'll have to cut something from your spending. So it's part of the decision-making process. I think that any other process that disconnects it has only one outcome. It will inflate defense expenditures, because if there's no clear price at the time of the decision, it's very difficult to make any other decision. That's regarding that matter. I don't think I have anything more to add to that. I would like to relate to what Yael said about the overall expenditure, and I'm going back to what Shmuel Abramson said earlier in the previous session, when he said that the decision about taxes and spending is ultimately a political decision. The government elected its representatives, they decide, and what we can learn from 2012 is that the government doesn't only have a technical problem regarding meeting its deficit targets and setting deficit targets, but where spending is concerned, the government is unable, has not been able on its own, I don't know what's going to happen in the future, to meet the rule or to follow the rule that it itself set, and that is to meet the commitments. And I think in the very dramatic climax regarding the budget for 2015-16, the increase in the spending of 4.5% when the ceiling is 2.7, and another addition that was called a one-time addition of 0.25%, and a gap of 12 billion shekels that remain from the 2017-18 budget. And here too, the government itself said something about its priorities, because ultimately it's the one that made these decisions. There wasn't an epidemic or something else that happened here. What we had was a series of decisions that the government made, and it thought that each of them was right, the right decision in its own right, and to decide where the government, with almost the lowest civilian spending in the whole OECD, and it wants to continue with that policy. And we have to understand that the windfall, it wasn't a windfall, but thanks to the drop in the interest costs of the government, that too is soon going to reach its maximum. And the question is if we're willing to pay more for the services that are being offered at this time. Before the next question, I'd like to say something more about the defense budget. Before we bought the F-35 planes, there was a very big argument between the politicians and the military establishment whether Israel at all needs those planes. The then Minister of the Finance, Yuval Steinitz, thought we didn't need those planes. Each plane costs 500 million shekels. 500 million. I'm not even talking about its maintenance, which costs very much. Each plane costs 500 million shekels. What could be done with that money in terms of the army or civilian areas, that's obvious. During Steinitz's time, it was decided to buy 19 planes. Now they're talking about 33, with the next target being 50 planes. So you can do the math. You can figure out how much it's going to cost. That's another question in the same family. And the next question, although Adi answered the next question unequivocally, why not a 5-year, 10-year budget, multi-year budget everywhere? For example, in the previous discussion, somebody asked, why not 20 students to a class? So the government representative said it costs a lot of money. So let's not talk about 40, let's talk about 30 students in a class in 5 years. In 1999, the Director General of the Treasury was Avi Ben Bazat, and I made that proposal to him, and he said to me, it sounds reasonable. Since then, 17 years have passed. A year ago, I suggested the same proposal to the current finance minister. He said, I don't have the money. I said, do it in 5 years. He said, that's a good idea. Maybe in 10 years. I said, make it part of the arrangements law. In 10 years, there was the arrangements law. And that proposal was not included, I'm sorry to say. The question is, why not a multi-year budget for all the other areas as well? I think that we need to distinguish here between a multi-year budget and multi-year planning. The army does what is known as a multi-year plan. It has a framework that the government more or less commits to, and it can do it. Now, the education system also needs to have a multi-year plan, and the health system, and certainly the transportation system, they all have to have multi-year plans or planning. But the budget needs to be annual. Why? Because there's a lot of uncertainty. There are things that happen. There are economic cycles, and there are taxes, and there are a lot of things. And you have to have a certain level of flexibility in your multi-year planning in order to continue to carry out the nucleus, although it may differ from one place to another. So we definitely need multi-year planning in Israel. Moreover, a lot of the expenditures, for example, in education are fixed sums. If you have teachers in the system, they're going to continue teaching. You have demographics. You need to plan ahead. For example, in the higher education system, they do multi-year planning because they know when they take a student in the first year, the university commits to give him a certain amount of things by the time he graduates. But that doesn't mean that the budget has to be multi-year. The 2-year budget becomes ultimately 2 budgets that are 1-year budgets. When there are so many adaptations along the way, they ultimately do away with the idea that there is actually a 2-year budget. And the problem is, it's more a constitutional problem. Somebody has to decide on the 2nd-year budget for 2017, in this case. Does it have to be the Finance Committee or the whole Parliament? That's what I have to say about that subject. Yes. I think there are a lot of components in the budget that are already multi-year this year. All the development budgets are multi-year, and the roads and many other things, and the health system. All development budgets are multi-year, and wages are also multi-year. The wage agreements, the current framework agreement that we signed a few months ago goes up to 2019, if I remember correctly. So that's a very significant part of the budget, like the defense budget, higher education, and so on. I think ultimately there has to be a certain measure of flexibility. I absolutely agree. There must be flexibility in the budget in the ongoing period. And secondly, if we accept the thesis, I agree that the policymakers are the ones who ultimately divide up the pie. The shorter the terms they are than the multi-year plans, then this, by definition, doesn't work together. A new minister is elected. He has his own priorities. He wants to, and that's how it is. I don't see any other solution. When we're talking about a multi-year plan as opposed to a multi-year budget, I think part of it is what we've become accustomed to in terms of budget. When we have, the budget has a few thousand item lines, and I don't know if it was 9,000, now it's 6,000 or less. It's a different world, and no one can budget it a few years ahead of time. If you think about it as something that has 200, 300 items, and the transition is to break them up to a few hundred lines each year. If the Ministry of Education wants to buy pens or pencils, I don't think it's that important, and those decisions can be passed. And that is one world, one area. Avia noted, and factually it's correct, because there are a lot of transfers of very large sums, and some claim that most of these transfers are known in advance, and they go every year from the same place to the same place. At the time, and this I can say, we did an analysis in the Bank of Israel, and we published it in the Bank of Israel report that identified those items in the budget that traditionally large sums are transferred every year. Since then, I haven't checked if the budget items have changed, but all in all, a great deal is known in advance. Yael noted something else, and it's very right, and it's the heart of the problem, and that's when a new minister is appointed. He wants to change things. So, first of all, the fact that ministers are constantly changing is not unique to Israel. It happens everywhere. And it's not a problem of ministry officials. It's a problem of government and culture. What does a minister do when he enters? In Sweden, it's different. In Sweden, they decide on the budget 3 years ahead. They don't decide on the current budget, because that's the culture. They say, okay, there was a government. We assume that everyone wants the best for the public, so we'll let those plans move ahead, and we're going to impact the future. But ultimately, I agree that it goes beyond the matter of officialdom and so on. It's a matter of political culture. When a new minister comes in, if he respects the existing plans and then he makes new plans knowing that the next minister will respect his plans. So there's an American expression that says the president has spoken. That's something that holds for 30 years. If a president has committed to something, pledged something, then he stands behind that pledge. It's like a check. And that's part of that culture that I wouldn't take quite that far, but in the short term, when there's a governmental plan and it's been authorized and you start working, it needs to be fulfilled. And ultimately, based on Professor Alan Bazin, he examined to what extent do changes in government impact public spending. It was done internationally, not necessary for Israel, and it was found that the more the governments change, the more stable government spending is, because nobody has a chance to make any changes because they're constantly being replaced. So at the end of that study, it was published in the Journal of Public Economics. We checked Israel as a case study. We're both Israelis, after all. And we indeed were one of the countries that make very few changes in the public spending, in the feeling that we make a lot of changes, because every minister thinks he's made big changes. But in fact, what happened was one minister moved it to the right and the other next minister moved it to the left. And in the meantime, the civil service officials do all the work. And I think that perhaps we should rethink these are political rather than technical solutions, how to create stability so it will benefit the government. Based on your experience with the defense budget, they decided on a 5-year plan last November. Do you think that budget will last, or in a couple years will the army ask for more? I prefer to talk about the past, and whoever wants to can extrapolate for the future. I think one of the things that we showed in various analysis of the Brender guidelines that we've published over the years, we saw that many of the additions that the Army asked for and very often received were the result that someone that at the beginning of the year someone lowered the budget below what had been agreed on, and then they had to insist, and they ultimately got it. And we saw at the end the budget for the 5 years of the budget of the Brender guideline was according to the guideline, but now They can't cut back anymore, even with flat budgets. They can't cut back on security. This was also part of the folklore. Those who were at conferences over the years, they saw that people in the budget department of the Ministry of Defense, they used to joke that we knew that at the beginning of the year they would ask us to cut back, because then the other ministers won't cut back on their budgets, and we knew they'd give it back to us in the end. And then in the end, they were insulted that they were telling us stories about how they were stealing horses, and then they were insulted that they were called robbers. And it's not that the ministry got more than it was supposed to get. It's that I think both sides are at fault. And either side believed the other, and ultimately they converged exactly according to the guidelines that had been set.
I think one of the basic problems was that the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Finance didn't even agree about that basic number. They said, okay, we said we'll add 4%, but Ministry of Finance said, the basis is A, and the Ministry of Defense said the basis is B. So part of the issue was, and maybe this is a little boring, but it's a little spicy, this detail nonetheless. If you read the report of the Locker Committee, you will see that they devote quite a few clauses to the technique. They say, we need the budget. I mean, their recommendation is that the budget should be fixed over 5 years or so, and that it has to be attached to the Consumers Index. Now, I actually happen to know, unfortunately it's a type of gossip, okay, it's not transparent, but I know that one of the big disputes between Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Finance was, again, attaching the budget to a certain index. I'm glad Yael is nodding. She knows it well from the inside. So there was a whole element of salary that had to do with it, and the salary is increasing in the army, so you have to give a sort of an increase. There was technology again is increasing, so you have to attach it to something. And there were a few people in the Ministry of Defense and Finance understood how it worked. So, and they kept arguing. So they said, stop. Maybe just link it to the Consumers Index, and that's the end of that. I imagine that the lack of consistency, or this technique that was used, it somehow served the system. It was just convenient for them to argue and dispute and say, you'll get this, you'll get that, you don't know anything, I know, whatever it was. And at the end of the day, I think that as a state, we have to, move forward. And part of moving up, that something is linked, it has to be linked in the proper way. I don't think there's no substitute for this, and I think our guest said it, there is no substitute for transparency. I think, the minute they have to publish the figures because it forces them to publish all the figures. The minute there's transparency, the whole system has to align itself vis-a-vis the transparency. And everything is done much more seriously from the executive. You can't improvise. It's not a matter of who will scream louder at the Prime Minister's house. And again, if you're willing to give 5, you want 3, then okay, let's compromise for 4 on 4. So it doesn't work that way. So it's not practical, it's not professional. This is one of the things that we need in order to turn us into a developed state, an enlightened state. It sounds maybe trivial, but this is what is happening in Sweden, by the way. And the fact that in Sweden things can be expected and anticipated, that gives them the leeway to deal with the real matters, with the important things. This is one of the ways to increase productivity. We kept talking about increasing productivity. This is one of the central ways to go about doing this. I hope this really is in Sweden. We talk about fiscal rules, so I think the mechanism that they had in the past was that every minister gets a framework, a certain budget for the next year or whatever it may be, or a few years ahead. And if one minister deviates from that framework and he wants to increase his framework, all the other ministers have to fund everything. And then there's this whole system within the government that every minister has to live within its budget. I don't know if it can work here in Israel in this way. But again, if we see, we have some sort of a multi, annual budget again, or forecast for the defense. Some of the expenditure will go down. I'm sorry, I cannot hear her. Please, she has to speak into the microphone. Can you please ask the speaker to maybe speak into a different microphone? This microphone is not working well. We apologize to our guests. Before asking the big question and the final question, I wanted to ignore it, but I really have to relate to it. But this has to do with transparency. In the previous October, we signed a 5-year plan for defense. 350 billion shekel, that's all. And during the agreement and the ceremony, they brought many people from the Ministry of Finance and the Minister of Defense, Minister of Finance. So where's the agreement? We asked. There was a whole press conference. And they said to us, oh, we told you the main thing. We asked, where is the agreement? No, we told you the gist of it. We told you the key. You'll get it in a month, we were told. After, the Director Generals will go over all the details. A month passed, 2 months passed, 3 months passed. We didn't get the agreement. The Globes, Kollias, and DeMarco, the 3 financial newspaper, turned to, again, the person in the Ministry of Defense responsible for freedom of media. And they said to us, no, Minister of Defense has to agree. So I turned to the Director General of the Ministry of Defense, and he said, no, the Director General of the Ministry of Finance has to agree. Okay, so then the person appointed for freedom of media, also we turned to him, and then he postponed it. He postponed it by 3 months. And then once again, I moved from one person to the other, from one ministry to the other. When those 3 months were up, we were summoned to a meeting with the seniors of the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Defense. Dana L. Was responsible, and he said to us, all the reporters are in Jerusalem. I will summon them for 8 in the morning. They'll have to be at 7:30 in the morning to stand outside in the security. Nobody will be able to come on time. That was a trick. So there was a debriefing, and we said, where is the document? They said, no, we told you everything already. We said, where is the document? And they said, no, we told you everything. So talk about transparency. The 3 newspapers turned to the courts in the hope that it will allow for the publication of the agreement in full, subject to censorship laws. Okay, now why am I saying this to you? Why is this so important? Because in 2008, a previous agreement was signed, and there was a Ministry of Finance, and there was a Director General of Finance, and there was a great clerkship there, and they were all patriotic. The document was only exposed a half a year ago. What was written in that document? That those who work in the IDF and those who work from the pension, the budget pension, to the gradual budget, will pay a certain amount, or whatever it was. Nobody knew about this. How could it be that I didn't know about this? And the Prime Minister, according to his spokesman, he went crazy. He said you have to halt this conduct immediately. So it was not halted. They found a different way to give the grant. But who can vouch for the fact that maybe in the new agreement there are exact same clauses there, and people just don't want it to be exposed? That just has to do with transparency. Okay, and then the final question, maybe the question. with a capital letter. In 2009, Minister of Finance, who was now Prime Minister, he passed a number of resolutions. They were the basis for the discussion for civil budgets and expenditure. Then the big cut was proposed. A month or so ago, the International Monetary Fund and the Bank of Israel said we have to understand the budgets, the civil budgets in the state of Israel. We have to pass these because we're in a bad state in comparison to all the developed countries in the OECD. My question is this possible? In the previous session, we presented a way that we can go about doing this. You said everything is political and personal. Some time ago, there was a similar discussion. And the person who prepared everything, this was actually my paper of mine. It was Natan Zussman. Today, he maybe has to be a little more, stately in what he says. But both of us proposed stopping the decrease in taxes because the ratio of government expenditure to GDP has already decreased too much. So we proposed to stop the decrease in taxes. And we both again agreed that in the political climate of back then, if we were to say that we have to bring up taxes, people would relate to us as if we betrayed the state. So we said, let's stop the decrease in taxes. Then there was a social protest, as you know. And in wake of that social protest, the representatives of the Ministry of Finance and Trachtenberg were able to stop bringing down taxes in Israel. So today at Van Leer, we actually moved over to the next stage. We said we have to bring up taxes. That means we think we can bring up taxes. And why? Because many of the taxes would decrease. So if they would decrease, why can't we bring them back up? So maybe there is this ratchet effect, yeah, with taxes that when you know that you bring down, it's oftentimes very difficult to bring them up again. But in any case, people don't even know how much taxes they are paying, because in Israel, a person looks at his net salary, doesn't know what the gross salary is, has no idea how many taxes he's paying, has no idea what his pension is, doesn't know anything. In contrast to the United States, where you actually fill out the tax returns, exactly what your gross earnings are, the net earnings are. Here, people won't even know if you bring up the taxes. So I think it will actually be so much more logical. I know it's a bit of a radical claim, but even if people do know that they're paying more, that's okay. So I think we can bring up taxes. That's the bottom line. I think, Yael, the question is mainly aimed at you. I think, with that head, because I'm representative of the state, it's a bit of a complex question. Things are still underway in the Ministry of Finance. These are internal matters, so I can't relate to everything particularly. But I think things are known. There are certain things that I would do, before the taxes were brought up. I would deal with others. Sometimes it's, again, sometimes there are certain tax rates. It may have a positive implication on growth, sometimes not. I think everything is on the table. That's what we are doing this year. But of course, there are all sorts of other deliberations that has to be taken into account before we adopt any such policy. So we'll have to see in the coming 2 weeks, I think, how we deal with this topic. Avi? Of course, we can increase expenditure. There are certain expenses that we pinpointed, as you mentioned as well. There are certain expenses that do support, certain deliberations in the long term, and we should adopt them. Whether in terms of investments or in terms of education, a certain expenditure is justified, even in terms of social solidarity. But at the end of the day, when you ask the questions whether this is possible, the thing is, where do you place the barriers? If somebody doesn't want, it's not always a question of, is it possible? And when I say I don't want, it's not like in just being, just being so narrow-minded or being a little politician. It doesn't mean that we are able to do it. That. What about if Natan is sort of less stately, so to speak? Would that be possible? I think that at the end of the day, the Israeli public chooses what it wants. I think it is our role to show the alternatives, to show the advantages and the disadvantages for every decision as a result of any decision that is taken. I think we did point to the fact that there are certain public expenses that that again fall short and could be increased and would serve us in the long term, but also people have to understand that they might have to pay more taxes, and that is why people elect the members of Knesset in democratic elections, so that they will promote their interests and what they want the future to look like. It is the public's decision at the end of the day, and the public elects. Can I just say something? But sorry, into the mic, please. I want to relate to the taxes. I want to relate to the claim that the public is not responding to the suggestion to pay more taxes. First of all, I think we showed this last year as well, that when you ask the public two questions, whether would you like the government to give more health services, more education, more welfare, most people say yes. But if you ask the public, are you willing to fund it by means of taxes, they say no. So presumably you think, oh, the public is not consistent. But in fact, I think this is what I think. I mean, this is how I can describe things. This lack of consistency represents the fact that the public perceives the government as something that cannot be trusted. They say to themselves, what? Oh, they're going to take money from me, but they won't give me anything. Okay, that's the government. That's how the government is perceived. And then there are two ways to contend with this. The one way is that the government will say, look, I've taken taxes from you, I've increased services, I have updated the health basket, I have brought down the number of students in a classroom, whatever it may be. And it has to be blatant, it has to be visible. Just like the Prime Minister comes, holds a press conference at 8 p.m. and he comes and he says, listen people, I've done A, B and C with the tax money that you've paid me. This is transparency. This is a transparency that actually connects between activities by the government and the results in the field. Another thing which is rather equivalent to this, let's say Minister Litzman, who's the Minister of Health, he wants to promote the health basket, whatever it is. And let's say he has a coalition agreement, and he goes to the government and says, "Oh, you have a biannual budget for 2017-18. I need the nursing care in the basket." So what can you do? You can do something dedicated for something, so that there will be this automatic connection between the fact that I will spend more on nursing, for example, or caregiving. And you'll get services, but you have to fund these. Same goes for, let's say I want to bring out the seniority allowance given by national insurance. I can create that connection in the consciousness and the awareness of the public. It creates reliability. It creates trust. The minute there is more trust and that connection is made, people respond. People are willing to respond. If, again, the government thinks that the whole principle of solidarity is important, so it has to educate the public for solidarity. How is this possible? If I want to give a poor person more money, I would like you to participate in this. It's not like this, you struck from heaven. If you want to, you can deal with something. Okay, I think because you've had, you actually asked, that question, and then it actually connects between the two parts of the conference. I think this would be a great point to end, and we're ending on time. And I would like to thank the participants. I would like to thank you, Moti, for moderating this panel. I would like to thank the panelists, the participants in the audience, the support that we've received from the Van Institute and from Tamar, and especially to Yarden Kedar, who really helped organizing this conference. Thank you so much, all of you.